Welcome to Zrok Office Hours. It's been a very long time since I've had a chance to do one of these, but it's Friday and there's a bunch of interesting stuff to talk about, so I figured let's go ahead and do one of these. The last real meat and potatoes Office Hours video I did was kind of back in the time period when we were releasing version 1. And I feel like we had a big run up to version 1. And honestly, here we are sitting on the precipice of version 2. So version 2 is a pretty substantial set of changes. I originally had intended to make it like a version 1.2, but as I started digging into it more and more, I started realizing that the changes are deeper and bigger than that, and it just kind of warrants a version 2. So version 2 is really the core of it is about how names work in Zrok. One of the things that I feel like was always a little bit of a sticking point with Zrok was the kind of how the reserved sharing worked, in that basically your share token was the namespace for what names were available. So if I happen to grab, API as a share token, or testing or something like that, then I'm the only one that's allowed to use that, even if, I'm using a custom front end with a custom domain, or, and that was basically because of the way Zrok evolved, in that the mechanism for mapping share names to ZD services was very basic, in that the public front end, the thing that accepts the HTTP traffic from the internet, would take the host header and try and parse the share token out of that. So it ended up being kind of a limitation, and that's one of the things that we've kind of needed to address for a while. So we've addressed it, and I'd kind of like to show it off a little bit. So I've got kind of my typical development environment here. I usually run a Zrok controller here. I run a metrics bridge here. In fact, let's start that up. I run a public front end here, and these other three windows are just kind of for showing stuff and doing development and things. So I've got what's basically a V2 controller sitting here with the new V2 tables for the new namespace stuff, but I haven't configured any of it. And I figured we dig in from the vantage point of setting it up as an administrator and kind of walk through how it works and everything. So there's a Zrok admin list front ends. Front ends still exist kind of the same way they always have. This URL template, like a front end, always has a token, has a ZD identity attached to it, has a name you can use to refer to it when you're creating shares, and it has like a URL template which explains to the controller how to generate URLs for that front end. In V2, this URL template is no longer used. It's still here because the plan for rolling V2 out is to run V2 and V1 in parallel, and all of the schema changes for V2 are additive until we get off of V1 in Zrok.io and a handful of other environments. So they're still here, and they're there just sort of to support a V1 instance running side by side. So in V2, this URL template will go away. So basically, a front end is a token, a ZD identity, and a name. The next layer that we need to sort of look at is now what I'm calling a namespace. So if we could do Zrok admin list namespaces, we don't have any, so we need to create one. So right now, if I was trying to create a public share in V2, it wouldn't know what to do with that. So we need to add a namespace. So we'll do Zrok admin create namespace help. So we're going to create a namespace called public. So just like in V1, there was always a front end called public that was sort of the default front end. In V2, there's a public namespace, which is the default namespace. So we'll skip the description. We'll mark it open, and we'll token is public. The market open, and then the name is actually the template for it. So we'll say token.zrok.quigley.com, port 8080, and you notice it leaves the HTTPS off. In V2, it doesn't automatically assume a protocol, so that's laying the groundwork for other protocols. The fact that a share could be HTTP or HTTPS, and a handful of other things. So now it doesn't require, you actually don't want to put the protocol in there. So we create a namespace, and then we do Zrok admin list namespaces. Oops, that's like I spelled public wrong. Admin delete namespace public, right? Let's fix that command. All right, so we got a namespace called public. It's marked open and it has a name format. We still can't create a public share in Zrok because we have to actually map the namespace to a front end. That's handy because you can map it to multiple front ends. You can create namespaces and then you can decide in your deployment how those namespaces actually get deployed onto front ends. So we have to do a zrok admin create namespace front end. We're going to say namespace token is public. We need to list front ends real quick. Do it down here. List front ends. Create namespace front end. Namespace token is this. And the front end, nope, namespace token is public, and the front end token is this. Right? So we created a mapping. So we're mapping the namespace public onto that front end. Now we effectively can create shares. So, and that works the same way it always sort of has. I can do a zrok share public, right? And I've got a name here. Let's take that and open it in a web browser, right? Oops. Oh, I'm not running a front end. Let's not get carried away. So we'll get to the front end details in a minute. I also like to zrok config set headless true. I typically avoid the TUI when I'm doing development. The TUI does need an overhaul that is coming at some point. It's just it's fairly low on the priority list, but I really would like to sort of make another round of improvements to the terminal UI. So if we do a zrok share public, you can see that works. Public bweb dot, and it just allocates a name in that namespace. There's a new command in zrok called zrok list names. So you can actually see what URLs and shares you've created, right? So what that's useful for is we can do things like this. As a zrok user, we can now say zrok create name. And we can say create name. That takes a namespace and it takes a name that you want to create. So the default is public. So I'm going to create a name called testing. So now I can do zrok list names. I've got testing.zrok.quigley.com in the public namespace. There's no share attached to it. So now in V2, names live in namespaces. They're controlled by namespace grants. So users, if the namespace is marked closed, you can control which users are allowed to create names in which namespaces. And those names are no longer attached to environments and shares. Like they're literally just names. So you can move if you have a name like this, I can then do like zrok share public namespace. That's actually shorthand for name selection. If we do help, a name selection is basically I probably need to fix that help up a little bit. But the way it works is like this: name selection, namespace, and name. So I can basically create, say I want to use that specific name, and I can say bweb dot, and you can see now I've got that share on testing.zrok.quigley.com. And if I do zrok list names, you can see that name is now bound to that share token. And if I kill the share, it's no longer bound. So let's actually create another namespace. So we'll just make a fictitious one. We'll say zrok admin create namespace. Token will be example, and the name will be, it'll mark it open. It'll be token.example.com, right? And then we'll go ahead and map it. Zrok list front ends, zrok admin list front ends. Do zrok admin create namespace front end, and the syntax was namespace token, which is example, and then front end is that. So now we've mapped it. Now we do zrok admin list namespaces. There we go. There's also an end user command, zrok list namespaces, which will show you which namespaces your account has access to. And I can still do zrok list names. Now I can do, so the nice thing about that is I can do zrok create name the namespace, I think the syntax was n. Yeah. N example testing. Oops. I can also do zrok delete name example test again and fix that. And now I own both of those. I own testing in both of those namespaces. And that I don't have to have any environments, I don't have to have any shares. That's all gone. So all public shares, all shares in zrok v2 are ephemeral by nature. We don't need a share to live for a long period of time. We don't really need to modify shares. We can just throw away a share and create a new ephemeral share and attach it to whatever name we want. So I can do things like this. I can say zrok share public, let's say n example testing and public testing, backend web dot. You can see now I've created testing. I've bound testing.example.com and testing.zrok.quigley.com to the same share. If I do zrok list names, you can see that both of those names are bound to the same share token. I could just as easily break those two apart and attach them to two different shares. So the decoupling of names to shares is completely revised in V2. This is a much better way of working. I haven't been able to think of a single thing that you can't do that V1 could do that V2 can't do in a better, more elegant way now. So that's sort of the primary motivation for V2 was fixing the namespacing issue, and it ended up being a fairly deep set of work. So it's been good. It's been healthy for the code base. It's been a good set of work overall. So now you can see if I do list names, those are both unbound, and I could create an ephemeral name. I could say public bweb dot, and then you can see it's allocated an ephemeral share name also. All right, so I've got all of those names, and if I kill that share, that ephemeral name is now gone. So speaking of that, another nice handy thing that you can do is public bweb. So let's just create we don't even need to say that the public is the default. So let's just do bweb dot. So let's just create an ephemeral share in the public namespace, right? Zrok list names, you can see there's my ephemeral share. One handy thing you can do, zrok modify name reserved equals true, and I can say that share name, you can see right here, it's marked reserved equals false. That's because this is an ephemeral share. So let's say I've created an ephemeral share and I've decided that like it's gotten popular, like I've needed, and I want it to live longer than this single share process. I can mark that for upgrade. So I can literally update that name and mark it as reserved. And now that name lives. If I kill the share, the name's still there. I can literally come in here, grab this name, and say namespace selection public that name, and now I've got a new share attached to that ephemeral name that I had created. So that's really, and I can also downgrade. So I could say zrok modify name r false, that name, and there you go. So that's basically namespaces in a nutshell. So with these changes, there's no more zrok release, no more zrok reserve, no more zrok share reserve. Those are kind of not needed at all anymore. So that removing that stuff kind of adds a minor wrinkle for private sharing, in that the reserve shares were super handy when you wanted to create a share name and reuse that name to give it to people for like zrok access private commands. So there is a facility we can use for that now. So I modified the zrok share private command now has a share token option. So you can say zrok share private share token testing. So just give it a share token name, bweb dot, and now you can see that it's got a custom share token. So that means I can do zrok access private testing, and that just works. So that's handy. That does give us a facility that makes reserved like private sharing useful. But if I do that, I think if I do Xerox testing and I do Xerox list names, you'll notice that doesn't show up anywhere in the namespace stuff. For now, those share tokens are just allocated in ZD. I'm kind of thinking that for like a 2. The next after the first initial release of 2.0, doing maybe a special namespace that's just used for private share tokens, something like that. That way you can kind of reserve them. But for now, we'll just roll out with using a share token if it's available. So yeah, there's that. Xerox config or Xerox status. The default front end is gone in the configuration. Now it's default namespace. So that defaults to public. So like if I wanted to use, I can do Xerox config set default namespace example, and then I could do Xerox share public. And now you can see I've created a name in the example namespace instead. So if I do Xerox list names, you can see that ephemeral share is in the example namespace. So there's control over that. So if you have a custom domain or a custom, with a namespace attached to it, and you want all your shares to default to that, you can do that. Config unset default namespace. Yeah, okay. So that I want to make sure the unset worked correctly. Also useful. Let's do Xerox share public namespace public testing an example, and then I keep using the web backend because it's super handy. You don't need to. It just points to the local file system. So if we do that, we can do Xerox list names. And in Xerox version 1, there's a Xerox overview command, which basically does this. It just emits JSON that shows you that you can use programmatically to sort of intuit what's going on in your Xerox environment. For V2, overview now actually provides more details. So it actually is a human readable format. So if I create another environment, I could do, let's come over here and do home equals temp junk. I think I've got an environment there. No, so we will do Xerox config set API endpoint to my local development environment. We'll do headless true. Then we'll do Xerox status secrets. You can see my secrets because this is literally localhost. So just take that and we'll do enable an environment there. So we enable a second environment. If we do an overview now, you can see there's 2 environments now. We can it's handy because we can actually do this. We can do Xerox share public b or n example testing b web dot, right? So now if I do a Xerox list names, you can see that there's now a share attached to all of my names, which is handy. If we do a Xerox overview, you can see that there's all the share details. It just makes it's a handy way to sort of quickly understand the entire structure of your account. So that's handy. So yeah, that's kind of the quick tour of how namespaces work. And you've seen me use this N flag a bunch of times. So like Xerox share public N, that's short for name selection. And that takes, I kind of blew through this really fast, but in detail, that takes a namespace token and optionally a name. So that would be the syntax for it. So if you just specify a namespace token, it's going to allocate an ephemeral name in that namespace. If you specify a namespace token : a name, then it will try and use a reserved name in that namespace. Out of curiosity, this should public bweb. Let's see what happens if I say public does not exist. What does that do? Yeah, that's what I would expected. So if you specify a name, it needs to be a name that you've already allocated. You can't just allocate an ephemeral name with a unique token. So that means, and then Xerox create name, anywhere that you would create name, like Xerox create name or Xerox modify name, those are gated by the limit system. They're gated by profanity screening, all that kind of stuff. Um, so yeah, that's kind of the quick tour of namespaces and names. So like I said, zrok reserve, zrok release, zrok share reserve, those are all gone now. And that means any scripts or things that kind of use those commands are going to kind of have to be rethought a little bit. And for rolling this out in the zrok IO environment, the plan is to stand up V1 and V2 in parallel to give people a chance to migrate. And we're still working through exactly how that will work, which kind of leads me to the next major point. So there's always been a zrok access public, which starts a public front end. That's the simple classic public front end that basically does host header share token extraction to do routing. With V2 and all this fancy new namespace stuff, we need a bunch of new facilities to map all those names to front ends. So there's a new, if we do a zrok access, there's a new front end called dynamic proxy. So dynamic proxy, and let's just open up the config file real quick. So let's look at my dev dynamic proxy config. So if you skip this top section, it has the OAuth section, just like the existing public proxy, where you can specify OAuth configure, OAuth client secrets and configurations, and then use those for shares. But it has some new stuff. So basically, it's got this. It has the dynamic proxy front end has to know what its front end token is, and it does that because it's basically in the zrok controller. There's a new dynamic proxy controller component which broadcasts mapping updates to the dynamic proxies as they're created and removed. So that's what this AMQP subscriber, the controller, that's what all these details are about, is configuring that infrastructure. So the quickest way to understand it is I'll just show you. So right now, let's just kill all these shares. So there really aren't any names. If I do zrok list names, I'm the only user. There's no shares in them. If we do a zrok overview, there's 2 environments, but there's nothing. There's no shares created in this. So if I start up a zrok access dynamic proxy, etc dev dash dynamic proxy. So if I start that up, you can see that it starts up normally, configures OAuth, all that kind of stuff. Connected its AMQP subscriber, retrieves 0 mappings. So when it starts up, that dynamic proxy controller endpoint in the zrok controller also vends mapping data to these dynamic proxy instances. So if you cold start a proxy, it will retrieve whatever mappings it's supposed to currently have. From there, it receives updates from the controller as they happen. So if we come in here and let's just clean up our environment, if we say zrok share public bweb dot, why did that not broadcast? Did I miss a config step when I did this? Oh, you know what it is? Maybe admin list front ends. That front end token should be right. I know. Let's look in the database. So what should have happened when I did that share is we should have seen a mapping update happen, and that did not happen. So before I started recording this office hours, I blew away the new data structures, intending to recreate them as part of this video. So let's see if we do select star from front ends, where not deleted, dynamic, dynamic should be 1 in this case. So there is a new column that's been added to the front ends table. So V2 zrok is designed to support both the legacy public proxy, the public front end, and also the new dynamic proxy. So we should be able to do update front ends set dynamic equals true, where ID equals 1, right? Yes. So if I restart this controller, it shouldn't need to be restarted, but I just restarted all stuff anyways. I should be able to do a zrok share public bweb dot. Yeah, okay. I don't know how that, I know what it was. Side note, for those of you that self-host, there's always been a zrok admin migrate command. It now has a down option where you can reverse migrate a database, which is what I did. So I reverse migrated the database to remove all the new structures before I started recording this video, and then I forward migrated it so all those new structures would be empty, and that would have wiped out that dynamic column. So I had to reset that value. So I just missed that in the initial setup. But yeah, which is probably worth pointing out anyways. But that dynamic column controls whether or not that front end receives mapping updates from the zrok controller. So yeah, so you can see as I add and remove shares that dynamic proxy is adding and removing namespace mappings, which is super handy because programmatically you can just create namespace mappings and configure them and have a single front end point your DNS and TLS at it however you want, and stuff just works. So you can use Acme and dynamically allocate TLS certificates. All those kinds of things will just sort of work naturally because this dynamic proxy doesn't need to understand anything about how the names are structured. So what it receives from the controller is, here's a name, which is basically a direct host header match, and here's the share token that matches that. Here's where it gets routed to. That's all it needs to know, which ends up making it a bunch faster in practice. So let's just show it working. I mean, effectively, it looks exactly the same as the old stuff. Public bweb dot. If we grab this endpoint, grab a web browser, and open it up, it's the normal stuff. Like it just works. The nice thing about it is that it ends up being a lot faster than the old proxy. There's just something about the fact that it doesn't have to hit the ZD SDK quite the same way. Like for 404s and like non-existent shares, that no longer even touches ZD now. Like if it doesn't have that mapping, it just doesn't, it returns a 404 instantly, which is nice because if I kill this share and then I go back to that same endpoint, it's super fast. Like it literally it was cached and I hit reload. Like it literally doesn't touch ZD at all, which can be nice for a bunch of reasons. So this dynamic proxy is going to be the foundation of a whole bunch of new functionality that's coming. We're going to have, traffic policies and WAF components built into these things. And there's a whole bunch of new infrastructure coming with this dynamic proxy, but that's sort of a quick sneak peek of that. Another nice thing that's received a bunch of attention in this release is that the zrok agent has been massively overhauled. So if we do zrok agent start, in fact, I've got an existing test scenario in here, right? So if I do zrok agent status, you can see now that there's an existing agent share because I've got the registry for the agent registry. It's got a public share in there, and it's bound to public testing. So and it restarted it. So previously, what the agent did was it would restart any reserved shares and private accesses. Those are the things that are most likely to need to be persisted. So the agent would maintain a registry of when you create reserved shares or private accesses, it would save those things and restart them whenever you start the controller up. Now that reserve sharing's gone, what it does is it preserves shares that have namespace selections that have actual reserved names in them, which is the analog to a reserve share in V2. It does that, and it also preserves private shares that have share tokens attached to them. And that's great. But the one of the things that was a problem in V1 was, let's say you had in that agent registry had a bunch of shares listed and your controller wasn't reachable, or one of those shares has some condition that needs to be met before it'll start correctly, like something didn't work properly. It would error out at startup, and you'd basically lose that registry entry. There wasn't any infrastructure in the V1 agent that knew how to sort of manage restarting those error conditioned access or share processes. Now it does that. So if we do a zrok agent status, you can see that this front end is in an error state, and it's retrying. It does exponential, back off, all that kind of stuff. It's currently out of the box set up to retry indefinitely. And you can see that there's a front end token of ERR underscore. That means it's an error token. What's nice about that is if that succeeds, it'll be replaced with the actual front end token of that front end. But I can do things like zrok agent release access, give it that token, and now I can clear that out. Right. So the way I created that was I took the share token off the public share, and I did zrok access private. Oops. That token, which works fine. If I do zrok agent status, you can see that that works fine. But this is an ephemeral share. All shares are ephemeral now. So if I stop and restart this agent, that access is going to come up in an error state because that share token's gone. Now this share is this. So if you're going to have a access that you want to preserve, that would need to point to a share with a stable share token, basically. But it's nice. That works. That same token allocation works for shares or, so like if I leave my controller down, so it's unable to be reached. If I start the agent up, it can't talk to anything. So if I do zrok agent status, both of those are in retrying states. If I bring my controller back up, oops, zrok control, let's have, right, start my controller back up. That will retry shortly, and when it does, it will come back up. And all of the endpoints for remoting, for status, all those things have been updated to work this way. Looks like it retried. So now you can see that share is active. This one's not going to succeed because it's referring to a non-existent share token, but this one restarted effectively. So that all works. That's super nice. The console has been updated to understand. Oops, I need to rebuild that real fast. That's the old console. So if we come over here, we kill this, we go into agent UI. Rebuild the front end code real quick. I literally just worked on this agent console stuff yesterday, and I haven't rebuilt the actual version in the binary. That's what I'm doing right now. So we do that. Rebuild it real fast. Start the agent back up when this is done. Right, start that up. We do a zrok agent console again. Open this up. There's our updated console. So you can see this access is in a retrying state. This one's active. It gives you a little bit more status and stuff. And it's nice because now you can, close. You can, just like you could before, you can manage resources from the web console. That all works. It's been updated to work with the new failure modes and those kinds of things. So that's done. Another internals thing that I think is important is it made the controller code a little tricky to read. If we look in the controller, there used to be a controller subpackage called zrok edge SDK. That's now gone. So that's been replaced with, and that was sort of the framework components that the zrok controller used to automate ZD. That code it sort of grew from zrok 0.1 and kind of didn't really receive any attention because it sort of worked, but it wasn't super clear and obvious how it worked. So that's been completely rewritten now so that it has a much cleaner set of implementation stuff around it where all the resources are managed the same way. It provides a really nice Fluent style API for managing those things. So if you go into any controller code, like let's take a complicated piece like share. If you look at share, let's go into where it allocates ZD resources. So allocate public resources. You can see where it basically tags, creates ZD configs, ZD services. So these things are all much clearer what's going on. They're all very fluent and they all work the same way. So that makes managing how zrok automates ZD much cleaner and much easier to understand, which means it's easier to maintain, which means we can do more and better things with it in the future. So anyways, that to make a long story short, that's kind of what's coming in zrok v2. This is still weeks away from being released. So you're seeing, code that's going to go through a bunch of rounds of polish still. There's still a lot of testing to be done. There's still a lot of polish for UX, that kind of stuff that needs to be dealt with. But the namespace structure, all the way the dynamic proxy works, the agent, all those things are pretty stable at this point, and they should be pretty representative of what it's going to be like when it's released. So thank you so much for listening to me ramble about this stuff. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions or comments, and I'll try and do some more of these in the future. So it's been a minute. A lot of life happened. A lot of work stuff going on. Just busy times, crazy world. But yeah, hope you have a good Friday, and see you in the next one.